Chapter 28 of Bullets and Billets by Bruce Bairnsfather. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 28. We march for Ypres. Halt at Locre. A bleak camp and meagre fare. Signs of battle. First view of Ypres. We marched off in the Bailleul direction, and ere long entered Bailleul. We didn't stop, but went straight on up the road out of the town, past the asylum with the baths. It was getting dusk now as we tramped along. The road to Locre, I muttered to myself, as I saw the direction we had taken. We were evidently not going to the place we had been rehearsing for. Locre. Ah, yes. And what's beyond Locre? I pulled out my map as we went along. What's on beyond Locre? I saw it at a glance now, and had all my suspicions confirmed. The word Ypres stood out in blazing letters from the map. Ypres it was going to be, sure enough. "It looks like Ypres," I said, turning to my sergeant, who was silently trudging along behind me. He came up level with me, and I showed him the map and the direction we were taking. I was mighty keen to see this famous spot. Stories of famous fights in that great salient were common talk amongst us, and had been for a long time. The wonderful defense of Ypres against the hordes of Germans in the previous October had filled our lines of trenches with pride and superiority, but no wonderment. Everyone regarded Ypres as a strenuous spot, but everyone secretly wanted to go there and see it for themselves. I felt sure we were now bound for there, or, anyway, somewhere not far off. We tramped along in the growing darkness, up the winding, dusty road to Locre. When we arrived there it was quite dark. The battalion marched right up into the sort of village square near the church and halted. It was late now, and apparently not necessary for us to proceed further that night. We got orders to get billets for our men. Locre is not a large place, and fitting a whole battalion in is none too easy an undertaking. I was standing about 100 yards down the road leading from the church, deciding what to do, when I got orders to billet my men in the church. I marched the section into a field, got my sergeant, and went to see what could be done in the church. It was a queer sight, this church. A company of ours had had orders to billet there too, and when I got there the men were already taking off their equipment and making themselves as comfortable as possible under the circumstances in the main body of the church. The French clergy had for some time granted permission for billeting there. I found this out the next morning, when I saw a party of nuns cleaning it up as much as possible after we had left it. The only part I could see where I could find a rest for my men was the part where the choir sits. I decided on this for our use, and told the sergeant to get the men along and move the chairs away so as to get a large enough space for them to lie down in and rest. It was a weird scene that night in the church. Imagine a very lofty building, and the only light in the place coming from various bits of candles stuck about here and there on the backs of the chairs. All was dark and drear, if you like. A fitting setting for our entry into the Ypres salient. When I had fixed up my section all right, I left the church and went to look about for the place I was supposed to sleep in. It turned out to be a room at the house occupied by the colonel. I got in just in time to have a bit of a meal before the servants cleared the things away to get ready for the early start the next day. I spent that night in my greatcoat on the stone floor of the room, and not much of a night at that. We were all up and paraded at 6 and ready to move off. We soon started and trekked off down the road out of Locre towards Ypres. I noticed a great change in the scenery now. The land was flatter and altogether more uninteresting than the parts we had come from. The weather was fine and hot, which made our march harder for us. We were all strapped up to the eyes with equipment of every description, so that we fully appreciated the short periodic rests when they came. The road got less and less attractive as we went on, added to which a horrible gusty wind was blowing the dust along towards us too, which made it worse. It was a most cheerless, barren, arid waste through which we were now passing. I wondered why the Belgians hadn't given it away long ago, and thus saved any further dispute on the matter. We were now making for Vlamertinghe, which is a place about halfway between Locre and Ypres, and we all felt sure now that Ypres was where we were going. Besides, passers-by gave some of us a tip or two, and rumours were current that there was a bit of a bother on in the salient. Still, there was nothing told us definitely, and on we went, up the dusty, uninteresting road. Somewhere about midday we halted alongside an immense grassless field, on which were innumerable wooden huts of the simplest and most unattractive construction. The dust whirled and swirled around them, making the whole place look as uninviting as possible. It was the rottenest and least encouraging camp I have ever seen. I've seen a few monstrosities in the camp line in England and in France, but this was far and away a champion in repulsion. We halted opposite this place, as I have said, and in a few moments were all marched into the central baked mud square in the midst of the huts. I have since learnt that this camp is no more, so I don't mind mentioning it. We were now dismissed, whereupon we all collared huts for our men and ourselves and sat down to rest. We had had a very early and scratch sort of a breakfast, so we were rather keen to get at the lunch question. The limbers were the last things to turn up, being in the rear of the battalion, but when they did, the cooks soon pulled the necessary things out and proceeded to knock up a meal. I went outside my hut and surveyed the scene whilst they got the lunch ready. It was a rotten place. The huts hadn't got any sides to them, but were made by two slopes of wood fixed at the top and had triangular ends. There were just a few huts built with sides, but not many. Apart from the huts, the desert contained nothing except men in war-worn, dirty khaki and clouds of dust. It reminded me very much of India as I remembered it from my childhood days. The land all around this mud plain was flat and scrubby, with nothing of interest to look at anywhere. But yes, there was just one thing. Away to the north I could just see the top of the towers of Ypres. I wondered how long we were going to stay in this Sahara, and turned back into the hut again. 2 or 3 of us were resting on a little scanty straw in that hut, and now, as we guessed that it was about the time when the cooks would have got the lunch ready, we crossed to another larger hut, where a large, bare wooden table was laid out for us. With sore eyes and a parched throat I sat down and devoured 2 chili sardines reposing on a water biscuit, drank about a couple of gallons of water, and felt better. There wasn't much conversation at that meal, we were all too busy thinking. Besides, the CO was getting messages all the time and was immersed in the study of a large map, so we thought we had better keep quiet. Our colonel was a splendid person, as good a one as any battalion could wish to have. He's sure to buy a copy of this book after that. He was with the regiment all through that 1914-1915 winter, and is now a brigadier. We had made all preparations to stay in the huts at that place for the night, when about 4 o'clock in the afternoon another message arrived and was handed to the CO. He issued his orders. We were to march off at once. Everyone was delighted, as the place was unattractive, and what's more, now that we were on the warpath we wanted to get on with the job, whatever it was. Now we were on the road once more, and marching onward towards Ypres. The whole brigade was on the road somewhere, some battalions in front of us and some behind. On we went through the driving dust and dismal scenery, making, I could clearly see, for Ypres. We ticked off the miles at a good steady marching pace, and in the course of time turned out of our long, dusty, winding lane onto a wide cobbled main road leading evidently into the town of Ypres itself, now about 2 miles ahead. It was a fine sight looking back down the winding column of men. A long line of sturdy, bronzed men in dust-covered khaki, tramping over the grey cobbled road, singing and whistling at intervals, the rattling and clicking of the various metallic parts of their equipment forming a kind of low accompaniment to their songs. We halted about a mile out of the city, and all fell out on the side of the road and sat about on heaps of stones or on the bank of the ditch at the roadside. It was easy enough to see now where we were going and what was up. There was evidently a severe scrap on. Parties of battered, dishevelled looking men, belonging to a variety of regiments, were now streaming past down the road, many French African soldiers amongst them. From these we learnt that a tremendous attack was in progress, but got no details. Their stories received corroboration by the fact we could see many shells bursting in and around the city of Ypres. These vagrant men were wounded in a degree, inasmuch as most of them had been undergoing some prodigious bombardment, and were dazed from shell shock. They cheered us with the usual exaggerated and harrowing yarns common to such people, and passed on. This was what we had come here for, to participate in this business. Not very nice, but we were all for it anyway. If we hadn't come here we would have been attacking at that other place, and this was miles more interesting. If one has ever participated in an affair of arms at Ypres, It gives one a sort of honorable trademark for the rest of the war as a member of the accepted successful matadors of the Flanders bull ring. We sat about at the side of the road for about half an hour, then got the order to fall in again. Stiff and weary, I left my heap of stones, took my place at the head of the section, and prepared for the next act. On we went again down the cobbled road, crossed a complicated mixture of ordinary rails and tram lines, and struck off up a narrow road to the left, which apparently also ended in the city. It was now evening. The sky was grey and cloudy. Ypres, only half a mile away, now loomed up dark and grey against the skyline. Shells were falling in the city with great hollow-sounding crashes. We marched on up the road. End of chapter 28. Recording by Philip Gould. Chapter 29 of Bullets and Billets by Bairnsfather. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 29. Getting nearer. A lugubrious party. Still nearer. Blazing Ypres. Orders for attack. After about another 20 minutes' march we halted again. Something or other was going on up the road in front, which prevented our moving. We stood about in the lane and watched the shells bursting in the town. We were able to watch shells bursting closer before we had been there long. With a screeching whistle a shell shot over our heads and exploded in the field on our left. This was the signal, apparently, for shrapnel to start bursting promiscuously about the fields in all directions, which it did. Altogether the lane was an unwholesome spot to stand about in. We were there some time, wondering when one of the bursts of shrapnel would strike the lane, but none did. Straggling small groups of Belgian civilians were now passing down the lane, driven out, no doubt, from some cottage or other that until now they had managed to persist in living in. Mournful little groups would pass, wheeling their total worldly possessions on a barrow. Suddenly we were moved on again, and as suddenly halted a few yards further on. Without a doubt, strenuous operations and complications were taking place ahead. A few of the officers collected together by a gate at the side of the lane and had a smoke and a chat. "I wonder how much longer we're going to stick about here," someone said. "What about going into that house over there and see if there's a fire?" He indicated a tumble-down cottage of a fair size which stood nearly opposite us on the far side of the lane. It was almost dark by now, and the wind made it pretty cold work standing and sitting about in the lane. 4 of us crossed the roadway and entered the yard of the cottage. We knocked at the door and asked if we might come in and sit by the fire for a bit. We asked in French, and found that it was a useless extravagance on our part, as they spoke only Flemish, and what a terrible language that is. These were Flemish people, the real goods. We hadn't struck any before. They seemed to understand the signs we made. At all events, they let us into the place. There was a dairy alongside the house belonging to them, and in here our men were streaming, one after another, paying a few coppers for a drink of milk. The woman serving it out with a ladle into their mess tins was keeping up a flow of comment all the time in Flemish. Nobody except herself understood a word of what she was saying. Hardy people, those dwellers in that cottage. Shrapnel was dropping about here and there in the fields nearby, and at any moment might come into the roof of their cottage or through the flimsy walls. We 4 went inside and into their main room, the kitchen. It was in the same old style which we knew so well. A large, square, dark, and dingy room with one of their popular long stoves sticking out from one wall. Round this stove, drawn up in a wide crescent formation, was a row of chairs with high backs. On each chair sat a man or a woman dressed in either black or very dark clothes. Nobody spoke, but all were staring into the stove. I wished momentarily I had stayed in the lane. It was like breaking in on some weird sect. Stove worshippers. One wouldn't have been surprised if suddenly one member of the party had removed the lid of the stove and thrown in a grey powder or something of the sort. This was to be followed by flames leaping high into the air, whilst low-toned, monotonous chanting would break out from the assembly. Feast in honour of their god Shrapnel, who was angry. I suppose I shouldn't make fun of these people, though. It was enough to make them silent and lugubrious, to have all their country and their homes destroyed. We sat around the stove with them and offered them cigarettes. We talked to each other in English. They sat silently listening and understanding nothing. I am sure they looked upon all armies and soldiers, irrespective of nationality, as a confounded nuisance. I am sure they wished we'd go and fight the matter out somewhere else. And no wonder. We sat in there for a short time and stepped out into the road again just in time to hear the order to advance. We hadn't far to go now. It was quite dark as we turned into a very large flat field at the back of Ypres, right close up against the outskirts of the town. Just the field, I felt sure, that a circus would choose if visiting that neighborhood. The battalion spread itself out over the field and came to the conclusion that this was where it would have to stay for the night. It was all very cold and dark now. We sat about on the great field in our greatcoats and waited for the field kitchens and rations to arrive. As we sat there, just at the back of Ypres, we could hear and see the shells bursting in the city in the darkness. The shelling was getting worse. Fires were breaking out in the deserted town, and bright yellow flames shot out here and there against the blackened sky. On the arrival of the field kitchens, we all managed to get some tea in our mess tins, and the rum ration being issued, we were a little more fortified against the cold. We sat for the most part in greatcoats and silence, watching the shelling of Ypres. Suddenly a huge fire broke out in the center of the town. The sky was a whirling and twisting mass of red and yellow flames and enormous volumes of black smoke. A truly grand and awful spectacle. The tall ruins of the Cloth Hall and Cathedral were alternately silhouetted or brightly illuminated in the yellow glare of flames. And now it started to rain. Down it came, hard and fast. We huddled together on the cold field and prepared ourselves to expect anything that might come along now. Shells and rain were both falling in the field. I think a few shells, meant for Ypres, had rather overshot the mark and had come into our field in consequence. I leant up as one of a tripod of 3 of us, my face towards the burning city. The 2 others were my old pal, the platoon commander at St. Yvon, and a subaltern of one of the other companies. I sat and watched the flames licking round the Cloth Hall. I remember asking a couple of men in front to shift a bit so that I could get a better view. It poured with rain, and we went sitting on in that horrible field, wondering what the next move was to be. At about 11 o'clock an orderly came along the field with a mackintosh ground sheet over his head and told me the colonel wished to see me. "Where is he?" I asked. "In that little cottage place at the far corner of the field near the road, sir." I rose up and thus spoilt our human tripod. "Where are you going, B.B.?" asked my St. Yvon friend. "Colonel's sent for me," I replied. "Well, come back as soon as you can." I left, and never saw him again. He was killed early the next morning. One of the best chaps I ever knew. I went down the field to the cottage at the corner, and, entering, found all the company commanders, the second in command, the adjutant, and the colonel. "We shall attack at 4 a.m. tomorrow," he was saying. This was the moment at which I got my fragment idea, "The push, by one who's been pushed. We shall attack at dawn." The colonel went on to explain the plans. We stood around in the semi-darkness, the only light being a small candle, whose flame was being blown about by the draught from the broken window. "We shall move off from here at midnight or soon after," he concluded, "and go up the road to St. Julien." We all dispersed to our various commands. I went and got my sergeant and section commanders together. I explained the coming operations to them. Sitting out in the field in the rain, the map on my knees being occasionally brightly illuminated by the burning city, I looked out the road to St. Julien. End of chapter 29. Recording by Philip Gould. Chapter 30 of Bullets and Billets by Bairnsfather. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 30. Rain and Mud. A Trying March. In the thick of it. A wounded officer. Heavy shelling. I get my quietus. At a little after midnight we left the field, marching down the road which led towards the Yser Canal and the village of St. Jean. Our transport remained behind in a certain field that had been selected for the purpose. The whole brigade was on the road, our battalion being the last in the long column. The road from the field in which we had been resting to the village of St. Jean passes through the outskirts of Ypres. and crosses the Yser Canal on its way. I couldn't see the details as it was a dark night and the rain was getting worse as time went on. I knew what had been happening now in the last 48 hours, and what we were going to do. The Germans had launched gas in the war for the first time, and as everyone knows now, had by this means succeeded in breaking the line on a wide front to the north of Ypres. The Germans were directing their second great effort against the salient. The Second Battle of Ypres had begun. We were making for the threatened spot, and were going to attack them at 4 o'clock in the morning. Ypres, at this period, ought to have been seen to get an accurate realization of what it was like. All other parts of the front faded into a pleasing memory. So it seemed to me as I marched along. I thought of our rest at the village, the billets, the curé, the bright sunny days of our country life there, and then compared them with this wretched spot we were in now. A ghastly comparison. We were marching in pouring rain and darkness down a muddy, mangled road, shattered poplar trees sticking up in black streaks on either side. Crash after crash, shells were falling and exploding all around us, and behind, the burning city. The road took a turn. We marched for a short time parallel to now distant Ypres. Through the charred skeleton wrecks of houses one caught glimpses of the yellow flames mounting to the sky. We passed over the Yser Canal, dirty, dark, and stagnant, reflecting the yellow glow of the flames. On our left was a church and graveyard, both blown to 1,000 pieces, tombstones lying about and sticking up at odd angles all over the torn-up ground. I guided my section a little to one side to avoid a dead horse lying across the road. The noise of shrapnel bursting about us only ceased occasionally, making way for ghastly, ominous silences. And the rain kept pouring down. What a march! As we proceeded, the road got rougher and narrower. Debris of all sorts and horrible to look upon lay about on either side. We halted suddenly and were allowed to fall out for a few minutes. I and my section had drawn up opposite what had once been an estaminet. I entered and told them all to come in and stay there out of the rain. The roof still had a few tiles left on it, so the place was a little drier than the road outside. The floor was strewn with broken glass, chairs, and bottles. I got hold of a 3-legged chair, and by balancing myself against one of the walls tried to do a bit of a doze. I was precious near tired out now, from want of sleep and a surfeit of marching. I told my sergeant to wake me when the order came along, and then and there slept on that chair for 20 minutes, lulled off by the shrapnel bursting along the road outside. My sergeant woke me. "We are going on again, sir." "Right-o," I said, and left my 3-legged chair. I shouted to the section to fall in and followed on after the battalion up the road once more. After we had covered another horrible half-mile we halted again, but this time no houses were near. How it rained! A perfect deluge. I was wearing a greatcoat and had all my equipment strapped on over the top. The men all had mackintosh capes. We were all wet through and through, but nobody bothered a rap about that. Anyone trying to find a fresh discomfort for us now that would make us wince would have been hard put to it. People will scarcely credit it, but times like these don't dilute the tenacity or light-heartedness of our soldiers. You can hear a joke on these occasions, and hear the laughter at it, too. In the shattered estaminet we had just left, one of the men went behind the almost unrecognizable bar counter, and operating an imaginary handle asked a comrade, "And what's yours, mate?" Again we got the order to advance, and on we went. We were now nearing the village of Weir, about 2 miles from St. Jean, which we had passed. The ruined church we had seen was at St. Jean. The road was now perfectly straight, bordered on either side by broken poplar trees, beyond which large flat fields lay under the mysterious darkness. As we went on we could see a faint red glow ahead. This turned out to be Weir. All that was left of it a smouldering ruin. Here and there the bodies of dead men lay about the road. At intervals I could discern the stiffened shapes of corpses in the ditches which bordered the road. We went through Weir without stopping. Passing out at the other side, we proceeded up this awful, shell-torn road towards a slight hill, at the base of which we stopped. Now came my final orders. "Come on at once. follow up the battalion, who, with the brigade, are about to attack. Now we're for it, I said to myself, and gave the order to unlimber the guns. One limber had been held up some little way back, I found, by getting jammed in a shell hole in the road. I couldn't wait for it to come up, so sent my sergeant back with some men to get hold of the guns and tackle in it, and follow on as soon as they could. I got out the rest of the things that were there with us, and prepared to start on after the battalion. "I'll go to the left, and you'd better go to the right," I shouted to my sergeant. "Here, Smith, let's have your rifle," I said, turning to my servant. I had decided that he had best stay and look after the limbers. I seized his rifle, and slipping on a couple of bandoliers of cartridges, led on up the slight hill, followed by my section carrying the machine guns. I felt that a rifle was going to be of more use to me in this business than a revolver, and, anyway, it was just as well to have both. It was now just about 4 o'clock in the morning. A faint light was creeping into the sky. The rain was abating a bit, thank goodness. We topped the rise and rushed on down the road as fast as was possible under the circumstances. Now we were in it. Bullets were flying through the air in all directions. Ahead in the semi-darkness I could just see the forms of men running out into the fields on either side of the road in extended order, and beyond them a continuous heavy crackling of rifle fire showed me the main direction of the attack. A few men had gone down already, and no wonder. The air was thick with bullets. The machine gun officer of one of the other regiments in the brigade was shot right through the head as he went over the brow of the hill. I found one of his machine gun sections a short time later, and appropriated them for our own use. After we had gone down the road for about 200 yards, I thought that my best plan was to get away over to the left a bit, as the greatest noise seemed to come from there. "Come on, you chaps," I shouted, "we'll cross this field and get to that hedge over there." We dashed across, intermingled with a crowd of Highlanders who were also making to the left. Through a cloud of bullets, flying like rice at a wedding, we reached the other side of the field. Only one casualty, one man with a shot in the knee. Couldn't get a good view of the enemy from the hedge, so I decided to creep along further to the left still, to a spot I saw on the left front of a large farm which stood about 200 yards behind us. The German machine guns were now busy, and sent sprays of bullets flicking up the ground all around us. Lying behind a slight fold in the ground, we saw them whisking through the grass 3 or 4 inches over our heads. We slowly worked our way across to the left, past an old wide ditch full of stagnant water, and into a shallow gully beyond. Dawn had come now, and in the cold, grey light I saw our men out in front of me advancing in short rushes toward a large wood in front. The Germans were firing star shells into the air in pretty large numbers. Why, I couldn't make out, as there was quite enough light now to see by. I ordered the section out of the gully, and ran across the open to a bit of old trench I saw in the field. This was the only suitable spot I could see for bringing our guns to bear on the enemy and assist in the attack. We fixed up a couple of machine guns and awaited a favourable opportunity. I could see a lot of Germans running along in front of the woods towards one end of it. We laid our aim on the wood, which seemed to me the chief spot to go for. 1 or 2 of my men had not managed to get up to the gun position as yet. They were ammunition carriers, and had had a pretty hard job with it. I left the guns to run back and hurry them on. The rifle fire kept up an incessant rattle the whole time, and now the German gunners started shelling the farm behind us. Shell after shell burst beyond, in front of, and on either side of the farm. Having got up the ammunition, I ran back towards the guns past the farm. In front of me an officer was hurrying along with a message towards a trench which was on the left of our new-found gun position. He ran across the open towards it. When about 40 yards from me I saw him throw up his hands and collapse on the ground. I hurried across to him and lifted his head onto my knee. He couldn't speak, and was rapidly turning a deathly pallor. I undid his equipment and the buttons of his tunic as fast as I could, to find out where he had been shot. Right through the chest, I saw. The left side of his shirt near his heart was stained deep with blood. A captain in the Canadians, I noticed. The message he had been carrying lay near him. I didn't know quite what to do. I turned in the direction of my gun section without disturbing his head, and called out to them to throw me over a water bottle. A man named Mills ran across with one and took charge of the captain, whilst I went through his pockets to try and discover his name. I found it in his pocket book. His identity disc had apparently been lost. With the message I ran back to the farm, and, as luck would have it, came across a colonel in the Canadians. I told him about the captain who had been carrying the message, and said if there was a stretcher about I could get him in. All movement in the attack had now ceased, but the rifle and shell fire was on as strong as ever. My corporal was with the 2 guns, and had orders to fire as soon as an opportunity arose, so I thought my best plan was to see to getting this officer in while there was a chance. I got hold of another subaltern in the farm, and together we ran back with a stretcher to the spot where I had left Mills and the captain. We lifted him onto the stretcher. He seemed a bit better, but his breathing was very difficult. How I managed to hold up that stretcher I don't know. I was just verging on complete exhaustion by this time. I had to take a pause about 20 yards from the farm and lie flat out on the ground for a moment or two to recuperate sufficiently to finish the journey. We got him in, and put him down in an outbuilding which had been turned into a temporary dressing station. Shells were crashing into the roof of the farm and exploding round it in great profusion. Every minute one heard the swirling rush overhead, the momentary pause, saw the cloud of red dust, then "Crumph!" That farm was going to be extinguished, I could plainly see. I went along the edge of the dried up moat at the back towards my guns. I couldn't stand up any longer. I lay down on the side of the moat for 5 minutes. 20 yards away the shells burst round and in the farm, but I didn't care. Rest was all I wanted. What about my sergeant and those other 2 guns, I thought as I lay there. I rose and cut across the open space again to the 2 guns. "You know what to do here, Corporal," I said. "I'm going round the farm over to the right to see what's happening to the others." I left him and went across towards the farm. As I went I heard the enormous, ponderous, gurgling, rotating sound of large shells coming. I looked to my left. 4 columns of black smoke and earth shot up 100 feet into the air, not 80 yards away. Then 4 mighty, reverberating explosions that rent the air. A row of 4 Jack Johnsons had landed not 100 yards away, right amongst the lines of men lying out firing in extended order. I went on, and had nearly reached the farm when another 4 came over and landed 50 yards further up the field towards us. They'll have our guns in section, I thought rapidly, and hurried on to find out what had become of my sergeant. The shelling of the farm continued. I ran past it between 2 explosions and raced along the old gully we had first come up. Shells have a way of missing a building and getting something else nearby. As I was on the sloping bank of the gully I heard a colossal rushing swish in the air, and then didn't hear the resultant crash. All seemed dull and foggy. A sort of silence worse than all the shelling surrounded me. I lay in a filthy, stagnant ditch, covered with mud and slime from head to foot. I suddenly started to tremble all over. I couldn't grasp where I was. I lay and trembled. I had been blown up by a shell. I lay there some little time, I imagine, with a most peculiar sensation. All fear of shells and explosions had left me. I still heard them dropping about and exploding, but I listened to them and watched them as calmly as one would watch an apple fall off a tree. I couldn't make myself out. Was I all right or all wrong? I tried to get up, and then I knew. The spell was broken. I shook all over and had to lie still with tears pouring down my face. I could see my part in this battle was over. End of chapter 30. Recording by Philip Gould. Chapter 31 of Bullets and Billets by Bruce Bairnsfather. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 31. Slowly recovering. Field hospital. Ambulance train. Back in England. How I ever got back I don't know. I remember dragging myself into a cottage in the garden of which lay a row of dead men. I remember someone giving me a glass of water there, and seeing a terribly mutilated body on the floor being attended to, and finally I remember being helped down the Weald Road by a man into a field dressing station. Here I was labelled, and sent immediately down to a hospital about 4 miles away. Arrived there, I lay out on a bench in a collapsed state, and I remember a cheery doctor injecting something into my wrist. I then lay on a stretcher awaiting further transportation. My good servant Smith somehow discovered my whereabouts, and turned up at this hospital. He sat beside me and gave me a writing pad to scribble a note on. I scrawled a line to my mother to say I had been knocked out, but was perfectly all right. Smith went back to the battalion, and I lay on the stretcher partially asleep. Night came on, and I went off into a series of agonizing dreams. I awoke with a start. I was being lifted up from the floor on the stretcher. They carried me out. It was bright moonlight, and looking up I saw the moon, a dazzling white against the dark blue sky. The stretcher and I were pushed into an ambulance in which were 3 other cases beside myself. We were driven off to some station or other. I stared up at the canvas bottom of the stretcher above me, trying to realize it all. Presently we reached the train. Another glimpse of the moon and I was slid into the ambulance car. In 3 days I was back in England at a London hospital. A fragment from France. End of chapter 31. Recording by Philip Gould. End of Bullets and Billets by Bairnsfather.